Hello and welcome. Today we'll have the pleasure to present to you our new report. The Brave Digital World. Is the EU ready to compete? I'm one of the co-authors of the report and my name is Adam Czerniak.
And I am the second co-author. My name is Miłosz Wiatrowski and I would like to warmly welcome all of you who decided to join with us today.
We'll start by presenting the report and then we will follow with a panel discussion. So please stay tuned. In the first part of the report, we analyze the role of European Union technological companies, which we call EU techs, in the European economy. But before I tell you what are the results of this analysis, I would like to explain what kind of company we consider as an EU tech. An EU tech is of course a technological company. This means that it provides services over the internet as an enabling technology. So this is a company that offers goods over the internet, for example as e-commerce. You got the Polish company Allegro, you got booking.com, which helps you with the use of a mobile application to find an accommodation you need in a country you need worldwide. Then secondly, an EU tech is of European origin. This means that it has to be founded in Europe. Of course, it can have a headquarters outside of Europe, but the core of its operations should be within the European Union. And last but not least, a European technological company differs from startups. Of course, startups are very, very important for the European Union economy, but EU techs are scale-ups, significant and well-known players in their fields. Consumers do know their names like Spotify or Zalando, or at least know their products by name. So, how many of this kind of companies are there in the European Union? In our analysis, we took 28 European Union countries because we did the analysis with the data for 2018. So we had United Kingdom included back then in the European Union. And altogether, in 28 European Union countries, there are 4,629 identified EU techs. The largest number of them is in the United Kingdom. Almost 1,000 entities are in Great Britain. Then you got Germany with over 900 companies and France with over 600 EU techs. The majority of EU techs are active in IT services and consulting. 29%, so over 1/4, produce software, and the rest is dealing with online services. Before I show you how much does EU tech weigh in the European economy, I would like to give you an overall view of what is the European Union data economy. The whole data economy within the European Union is equal to 2.6% of the European Union GDP. And of course, apart from companies that are of European origin, within the European Union, there are also global techs that operate via a subsidiary that is registered in the common market, and there are also non-EU techs, as for example AliExpress, who is offering services to European consumers, but without having any entity or subsidiary within the European Union registered. This is very important as each of those three groups, so EU techs, global techs with their subsidiaries, and non-EU techs, is regulated in a different manner. And for example, non-EU techs do not need, or sometimes they need, but do not obey European Union regulations. So now, what is the footprint of just the EU techs, those over 4,500 companies I mentioned before? Their total revenues are equal to over 400 billion euros, which is by coincidence also 2.6% of the European Union GDP, and they employ 2.2 million people, which they pay a quite good sum because this average gross wage is higher than the average wage within the European Union. They pay almost 59,000 euros annually. And also, they're quite good taxpayers. They pay 26% of their gross income as corporate income tax to local state budgets. The largest amount in comparison to the whole economy of EU tax is present in Luxembourg, Ireland, Germany, Sweden, Finland, and at the second place there is Poland. That's the country from Central and Eastern Europe that has the highest share of EU tax in their economy, and is also one of the biggest mother countries within the European Union, with 6% of GDP generated by EU tax. And now let's compare EU tax to their peers, so to technological companies that have a subsidiary in the European Union, because we have the data on both of these kind of companies. So, EU tax generates 73% of technological company revenues within the European Union. Non-EU tax, so those global tax operating via a subsidiary, only 27%. EU tax employ 87% of people working in technological companies. Non-EU tax, just 13%. You might think, okay, this means that people working at EU tax are less productive. No, it's the opposite way around. Global tax, operating via a subsidiary within the European Union, just generate revenues that are transferred back home outside of the European Union, so they do not need as many workers as companies that have their core business located within the European Union. This means that the subsidiaries are quite often just facade companies that are needed to generate profits within the European Union to sell their products, but the core business, which of course means higher employment, higher wages, is located outside of the common market. And the same goes with taxation. Companies that operate in the European Union only through their subsidiaries pay less than 6% of their gross income as corporate income tax. That means that they pay less than 1/4 of the amount of taxes that EU tax pay to local budgets. And what's more, we say that there's less than 6% because majority of subsidiaries of global technological companies even do not provide any data on how much taxes they pay within the European Union. It's quite important to know that EU tax are leaders in sectors like mobile apps, internet security provision, or e-commerce, and global tax are leaders in developing operating systems for smartphones and also in generating search engines. If you focus only on e-commerce, you see that there is a growing amount of European Union customers that buy goods from non-EU tax companies, so from those companies that has nothing to do with the European Union, but which provide services or goods to European customers. And as you see here, in countries where there is a well-established local e-commerce provider, the share of people buying goods from non-EU e-commerce sellers is much lower. Here you have the example on the slide, that's Poland and Romania. What will be the position of EU tax in the future? Here on the slide you got forecasts made by IDC and the Lisbon Council, which project an optimistic scenario. The data economy in the common market will reach over 6% of GDP. But in a pessimistic scenario, in a challenge scenario, it will reach only 3.5% of GDP by 2025. What are the determinants? Which part EU tax will follow? This will tell you Miłosz Wiatrowski in the second part about legislation. I would like to underline that part that without providing support for EU tax, both financial and regulatory, we can end up in a pessimistic challenge scenario in which European consumers will be served by non-European Union technological companies.
We will now focus on how those legislative efforts and initiatives by the European Commission and Council and the European Parliament can help not only EU consumers to harness the benefits of the digital revolution, but also EU companies. First of all, in our report, we argued that the EU needs to be clear about the necessary trade-offs in its approach to the digital era. EU goals in the digital sector vary from the traditional ones, which include dismantling barriers to trade and creating a genuine single market, to a more sector-specific ones, such as ensuring strategic autonomy, which is a bigger concern when it comes to digital technologies. For many of them are so-called dual use. They not only have commercial applications, but also potentially military ones, with the key interesting factor when it comes to digital technologies are that whereas usually military technologies spill over to consumer markets, in the digital sector the relationship is reversed. Very often the innovations are first created for consumers to operate on consumer-centered markets, and then we discover that they also have military applications important for our economic and military sovereignty. And so this goal of strategic autonomy or self-reliance is something that differentiates digital sector from others. When we looked at what objectives, what goals the EU has to fulfill when it comes to responding best to the challenges associated with the digital era, we enumerated three major objectives. The first one, as I said, is the traditional one associated with the European integration. It concerns harnessing the digital age to strengthen the four freedoms, to strengthen the single market, to provide EU consumers with the best choice of high-quality goods and digital services. To achieve that objective, the traditional standard regulatory approach that the European integration relied on, which is mainly about maximizing consumer welfare, is sufficient. However, for the two other objectives, other regulatory approaches are more suitable. The first of the two remaining objectives relates more to what Adam Czerniak was talking about, which is ensuring the competitiveness of EU companies, making sure that EU consumers are not only at the mercy of non-EU digital companies, non-EU techs. For that goal to be achieved, a purely consumer-focused approach is not sufficient, and one that integrates also looking at companies, the EU companies' welfare has to be analyzed. And an approach that not only looks at consumer welfare, but also on companies' welfare needs to be adapted. The final objective is the one I already mentioned, which is strategic autonomy or digital sovereignty, or any number of names that focus on ensuring that EU is most possibly self-reliant when it comes to digital technologies. It does not have to rely only on American or Chinese companies and their technologies when it comes, for example, to artificial intelligence. A preferred regulatory approach to achieve this goal differs very strongly from the traditional regulatory approaches of the EU. It relies not on free trade or maximizing consumer welfare, but instead on maximizing economic self-reliance, possibly through protectionism or even measures that may seem autarkic. So there is a huge difference between those three objectives in terms of preferred regulatory approaches. And for the EU to be able to tackle all three of them and to succeed in the digital era, it has to be fully aware of the trade-offs between the three and not push them aside and just focus on doing business as usual. Unfortunately, in our view, the existing legislative landscape does not adequately address especially those broader strategic concerns. Regarding consumer protection, one of the three areas our report focused on, the current decentralized law enforcement, the decentralized approach to enforcing EU regulations, fails to ensure a level playing field between EU-based platforms and companies which serve EU consumers but operate from outside the EU, especially as their size and economies of scale allows them to pick and choose where to abide by the rules, especially if a country has a track record of being a more stringent enforcer, or where to try to ignore them, assuming that consumers will not bring legal action against the companies, against the global giants. So the lack of effective centralized enforcement is something that, in our opinion, is a significant threat to both EU online buyers, but also sellers. EU-based companies are usually more focused on single particular nation-state markets, and therefore they abide all the rules that are required to stay in the market for because their reputation relies on it. When it comes to the second of the issues or sectors that we looked into, namely EU's policy towards the digital sector and digital platforms, we noticed that the regulatory approach is strongly influenced by global giants that operate in those marketplaces. Whereas, for example, the platform-to-business regulation applies to almost all platforms operating in the EU, it is very clear that the platforms that the Commission had in mind when designing this regulation, when drafting the regulation, was clearly eBay and Amazon, for they are the platforms that enjoy by far the most asymmetric advantage over the sellers that they are serving. So when creating a regulation that is trying to address the perceived asymmetry in power and purchasing power between sellers and platforms, the EU focused on the most acute examples, such as I mentioned, Amazon and eBay. At the same time, the regulation applies to all platforms regardless of their size, as long as they have more than 50 employers and a turnover higher than 10 million euros, which means that this one-size-fits-all approach imposes disproportionate costs in terms of adjusting to the regulation for smaller platforms, taking away their ability to compete and innovate so that they can remain competitive on the market against those global giants. And this is particularly important because in the EU, as Adam Czerniak mentioned, eBay and Amazon are not the dominant companies on all national markets. In the Netherlands, in Poland, or in Romania, it is the EU-based marketplaces that are the market leaders despite their competitive disadvantage due to smaller scale when looking at Amazon or eBay. So those scale-ups are very successful already and have to have a chance to be even more successful by innovating and focusing on making their product better, while the current regulation is putting additional burden which makes it more difficult for them, therefore actually acting in the interest of those very companies, eBay and Amazon, that it is trying to regulate and it is trying to contain. Finally, the third sector that we are looking into is artificial intelligence, one where EU so far is mostly at the conceptual stage of regulatory efforts. And so far, those regulatory efforts focus particularly on the ethics of AI. And it is hardly surprising because artificial intelligence has very disruptive and potentially negative impact on our privacy, and therefore ethical concerns are very important. However, they are not the only ones. And here strategic autonomy comes back and has to be taken seriously. For the issue is not only whether artificial intelligence in Europe will be ethical, but also whether it will be governed by rules that the EU has created, or rather by rules that are imposed to us from outside, because the companies that will be dominating this market will be coming from outside the EU. In 2017, only 4% of the world's data was stored in the EU, even though EU's economy accounts for 1/5 of the global nominal GDP. And so instead of aspiring to catch up in the long term, because of the knock-on effect of innovation and because of the fact that current advantages in AI translate into further, even more difficult to catch up advantages in the future, the EU has to rethink its approach to data and to the sector and not focus solely on the ethics of it. To conclude, we offer 3 large recommendations, 3 big recommendations concerning the regulatory approach of the EU that should be heeded if EU is to compete in the digital era. First, on issues where EU's main concern is related to the asymmetric power wielded by the global giants, the regulatory paradigm should not be a one-size-fits-all macro-regulation, but instead a targeted approach which really attacks the issues at stake and focuses on those few companies that are considered to pose a threat for the EU. In cases, however, where a macro-regulatory catch-all approach is necessary, such as consumer protection, effective enforcement mechanisms have to apply to all companies. That should be the EU's priority, to make sure that when a regulation has to be a one-size-fits-all, then it also applies to all, and not in a disproportionate manner to the EU-based companies. And finally, in order to prosper, EU-based scale-ups should receive much stronger support by the European Union. When we look at the artificial intelligence sector, EU companies are critically underfunded, and therefore a much bigger role of the public sector is necessary. That concludes our presentation. I would like to thank you for your attention and invite you to our discussion.